So let's get more on this story from Michael Kimmage. He is a history professor at the Catholic University of America and a former State Department Russia-Ukraine expert under President Obama. I'm pleased to welcome him back on DW News. And we've just heard that Putin has secured China's backing in his standoff with the West over Ukraine. So what will the practical implications be of what they're calling this strategic partnership?
Well, a little bit less than meets the eye. Certainly, if Russia does engage in a wider war in Ukraine, China is going to be nowhere near Ukraine. China has its own economic interests in Ukraine, is a little bit skeptical of a wider war there. I think what Russia really wants is help with sanctions, if that comes from the European Union and from the United States. And there it's not entirely clear that China will be fully behind Russia as well. So it's an important media display of unity. There are a few cracks behind the edifice.
But following on from that, would that then affect, let's say, the United States' ability to take punitive action or isolate Putin should Russia indeed invade Ukraine?
It's certainly a limiting factor in terms of Russia having something of an alternative, but it really remains to be seen whether China could bail Russia out from the massive sanctions that Washington, Berlin, Brussels, London, and Paris have promised. So it's a limiting factor, but it's not one of the primary factors either in Putin's calculus or in the calculus of the West, what China will do.
Now, both Xi and Putin condemned NATO expansion, but I want to ask you, is that really the reason Putin would potentially risk Russian lives and the crippling of the economy through retributive sanctions?
No, the principle of NATO expansion is something that Putin cares a lot about and is trying to revise at the moment through diplomacy. But if he goes to war in Ukraine, it's really about the military relationship between Ukraine and the West. Of course, Ukraine is not a NATO member. There's very few prospects for it to join the NATO alliance. So it's a little bit of a red herring. It's about sort of who calls the shots in Ukraine. And that's what Russia wants to do, and it wants to push the West back on its heels. But NATO is to a degree peripheral to all of that.
In addition to having an upper hand in calling the shot, what else does Putin stand to gain from an invasion of Ukraine? And is there actually a political appetite for it at home?
I think that there's very little political appetite for it, but it's not as if I think Russians would really protest if it were to happen. To a degree, I think Putin has a free hand in terms of domestic politics. I think what Putin would seek to gain is really the deciding role as to where Ukraine falls on the map of Europe, which is a very significant question. And if he can't quite determine that question positively, there are ways in which he can prevent certain outcomes from happening, and that's where military action has its attractions for Putin at the moment.
Now, the Western allies are reinforcing their military capabilities in Eastern Europe. In your view, is this the right way to dissuade Russian aggression?
I don't think it will have any deterrent effect on Russia. I think what it is an effort to reassure the Baltic republics and Poland to contain the spillover effects of a possible wider war. But it's not a factor if Russia's going to go in. Of course, these troops are not being sent to Ukraine, and the commitment to Ukraine in military terms has been rather modest. So it's really about something else other than the Ukraine conflict at the moment.
Michael Kimmage, history professor at the Catholic University of America. We're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me.